All right. Good morning, everybody. This is Kyle Westendorf with the Department of Market Monitoring. Thank you for joining today's web conference on DMM's Resource Efficiency Evaluation Report for January 2022. So going back to the beginning of these, DMM has been asked to publish regular special reports on the resource efficiency evaluation. The reports are released monthly, and that includes the underlying data. But the reason we're hosting the call today is to highlight a new section and metrics from the latest report. These metrics look at the impact of excluding some offline capacity from the bid range capacity test. So these are changes which were included in the RSC Track 1A proposal and recently approved by the board. Now, I don't expect we'll need the full hour today, so definitely feel free to ask questions. And if there are any questions on any of the report that is not covered in this presentation, I could also take those at the end. And also just a reminder that the report, presentation, and other materials can be found on the market monitoring page at KISO.com. And last, before I begin, let me reiterate this, that calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meeting. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meeting. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. All right, so with that, let me start with a quick recap of how resources are counted in the capacity test and what the enhancement is doing. So the test currently does not consider any resource temporal constraints. So these are your ramp rates, startup times, or transition times. So a resource that is offline at the time of the test would still be counted up to its maximum. This is still counting for any D rates or ancillary service schedules. But now with the enhancement, it's removing offline capacity from the test that could never have started within the short-term unit commitment horizon. So that's the 4.5-hour lookout. So the idea is that this will help towards only counting capacity that was made available for the market to use. So if we jump into some of the analysis, first starting with the impact on KISO during the highest load days of last summer. This was something that was specifically requested by stakeholders. For these metrics, DMM estimated offline capacity that would not have been counted. This is based on the revised draft final proposal. And this is after accounting for resource start times and bid availability. What we're showing here, first in the total height of the bars, shows incremental capacity that was counted in the test last year. Then with the red bars, it's showing capacity that would have been excluded under the enhancement. This is for July 9th, and the last thing we're showing with the lines is both the original requirement, the test requirement that was in place last summer, as well as what the requirement would have looked like without uncertainty. So for this day, July 9th, which was the day in which KISO hit a stage 2 energy emergency, there was 500 megawatts of capacity that would have been excluded in each interval here. And this was because of a single long start resource that was returning from outage and was not able to come back during this evening period. So if you look at the original requirement that was in place on this day, and you compare that to the total height of the green bars, you can get a sense of the impact of the enhancement on this day. So here, it would have caused 2 additional failure intervals, both here in hour ending 18 interval 4, and here hour ending 21 interval 1. Now, before I move to the other days, I just want to talk about this dashed gray region that I'm showing on this metric. This is capacity which was not operationally available in real time. So this is accounting for all resource constraints, start times, transition times, ramp rates. So in this dashed green region, you could imagine a resource that was online, but because of how the unit was positioned going into the start of the test and the unit's ramp rates, maybe not all of that capacity was available in that interval. So it was not available in real time. But I want to add that this is something that stakeholders asked for DMM to highlight, but it doesn't mean that all of this capacity should be excluded from the test. DMM has talked about this in our stakeholder comments, that the capacity test should generally reflect all capacity that suppliers made available for the optimization to use. So this would include capacity which might not have been online or operationally available at the time of the resource efficiency evaluation, but could have been reached based on the economics and dispatch decisions of earlier intervals. So in this case, the capacity was made available to the market, but the optimization chose not to use it. Before I move to the other days, let me pause here and see if there's any questions for this day in particular or about the framework of the analysis.
There's a question from Michelle KISO. Roy, if you could go ahead and unmute her line. Thank you.
Hi, this is
Michelle, if you could announce who you're representing for everybody.
This is Michelle KISO from the CPUC's Energy Division. And I just had a couple of questions. The first of which is, do you guys post your videos of these conference calls on your website? I'm not sure I've seen them.
So Michelle,
yes,
I'll take that.
They will be, go ahead.
We do post these. It does take some time for them to be posted, the recordings. The other thing I'll say is that we don't typically do calls or host calls for every report. As in this case, we do it when we introduce a new metric.
Okay, and then my question is, I see that you're showing this, but I'm wondering how this relates to the idea that Western EIM advisory imports support exports. So embedded in this test is the exports that we're supporting, right, based on potential EIM transfers. Is that right?
Right. So this is, I think that would be handled in phase 1B of the stakeholder initiative. This is a very kind of narrow focus look at one aspect of the enhancement for phase 1A, which was the treatment of offline resources. So it's not looking at any of the other changes in phase 1A or some of the other potential changes for 1B.
Okay, so this is only looking at the difference between the offline versus online capacity. It's not looking at the fact that the exports that are embedded in this might have been supported by transfers that weren't included in the RSE. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. So the other two pieces from 1A, which aren't included here, just to kind of better show the impact for offline resources. But 1A also had some pieces related to the treatment of battery resources and state of charge, as well as the treatment of intertie resources based off of whether or not they were tagged or not at T-40, which isn't included here. It's very much just this piece with offline resources and what that looks like.
Okay, and then maybe I'll just ask this question since I have you guys here. Did you do any work in this report, or do you expect to do any work on the number of resources that would have failed at the T-40? I feel like there's sort of been generic information on it, but not specific information on what fails at T-40 and then subsequently fails at T-20, or the maximum amount. I've seen sort of gross numbers, not any detailed about that. Do you guys do any work on that? And would it be possible to do that?
So are you asking about like the changes related to the tagging of intertie resources at T-40, or just like generically the test results at the different windows, the T-40 minus 75 or T minus 55 and T minus 40.
Well, I guess right here you're looking at since you've changed the metric to exclude capacity not available in the stuck horizon and what the effect of it. One question might be to look at the effect of excluding imports at the T minus 40, right? That don't have
Yeah,
transmission
that's something
times.
we could look at in future analysis, which is kind of getting to the other parts of the proposal. But
Yeah, that would be.
I think for this particular analysis, we didn't want to kind of blur the lines of the different impacts of the different pieces. So right now we're just showing, one side.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess if people have asked for this analysis, this is great. And I guess if we could ask for the T minus 40 more additional information on the failures at T minus 40, especially on tight system days and certainly on July 9th. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for your comment. We could look into that.
Sure.
There's also a question on the phone from John Dieppe. And John, if you could also introduce yourself and who you're representing. Thank you.
John, please make sure your microphone is unmuted.
Can you guys hear me? Hello, can you guys hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay, sorry.
I can hear you.
Yeah, this is John Diff from Southern California Edison. I just wanted to see how you guys considered demand response supply side resources, like your reliability demand response resources, how that gets factored in this. Is it part of the excluded capacity, or is it part of the included capacity, or neither?
Yeah, so right now on the current construct of the bid range capacity test, any incremental bid-in capacity from DR resources above what was their base schedules would be included as available capacity. And I'll just add that with the excluded capacity, everything that we're showing here is related to offline resources and almost entirely because they were either long start or extremely long start, which could not start within the stuck horizon. So it's not excluding any of the DR resources.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions before we move on?
Okay, let me jump into the other highest load days for KISO, and I won't go into each of these individually in great detail, but I want to talk about at least a few of these. So for September 8th, this is a day in which KISO hit its highest instantaneous load for the year. What we saw for this day was that for hour ending 17, the enhancement would have excluded some capacity, but not in the remaining hours. For this particular day, it was because of a long start resource, which was scheduled and online for the highest load hours, but could not have been committed within the stuck horizon for hour ending 17. So on this day, there was no difference with enhancement with regards to passing or failing the test. And when we look at like the other highest load days, the results are really quite similar, with the enhancement not making any difference between passing or failing the test. So here is August 16th and September 7th. Overall, what we saw last summer for KISO is that the enhancement does help to remove clear cases in which capacity should have been excluded. You can think of your extremely long start resources, which could not have been used by the real-time market, but I wouldn't characterize it as having a large impact on KISO passing or failing the test. And I just want to add one last date, which was July 28th, which was the only other day last year besides July 9th when the enhancement would have had an impact on KISO's test results. On this day, an outage was lifted for a resource in hour ending 19, but it wasn't able to return within the short-term unit commitment horizon. So on this day, even though that excluded capacity was relatively small, it would have been the difference between KISO passing or failing the test in 4 intervals. Let me pause here and see if there's any questions on the KISO side of things, and then I can move on to the rest of the Western energy imbalance market.
Roy, if you would unmute Michelle KISO, please.
Hey, you guys, sorry, I'm going to harp on this point again. So this is Michelle KISO from the CPC Energy Division. So given that these stress system days, looking at July 28th, July 9th, September, I believe, 6th, and September 7th, it looks like we were pretty darn close to failing between hours 19 and 20, which to me highlights the importance of KISO's proposal on the T-40 tagging requirement. So if you added this and you failed to include the T-40, it looks like it's, pretty likely that we would have failed in T19 and T20 on pretty much all of these days, which to me also raises the question of this issue where transfers and HASP imports support exports. So I'm going to go back to the September, I guess the July and September, and see whether we were exporting during these days. But it seems problematic if we're supporting exports on HASP imports that potentially don't show up at T-40, or we're supporting exports on EIM transfers and then fail the test as a result. And this is only going to get worse with regard to the T-40. So it kind of does seem important to look at the T-40 issue and then also simultaneously look at the exports that are being supported so that you can get a full picture of what's going on here. So that's just a request. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Michelle. We can do that. I agree. I haven't looked at how many of the T-40 interties were tagged or not, and how much that would have an impact on these days with regards to passing or failing the test. And then I think a lot of the conversation surrounding the exports, which are really baked into the test requirement, is something that warrants more attention.
Right, but I'm seeing this as a potential reliability issue this summer if on these days in July, which weren't 45,000 days, and if you look at September, they're 45,000 days, it seems very possible that we'll fail the test as a result of these two issues. So anyway, just a note. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Roy, if you would go ahead and unmute Dan Williams.
Hey, good morning. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. This is tangential, but just the other thing that stands out when looking at these high demand days is just the large amount of difference in the volatility of the requirement across these different days. As you look at some of the days in July, there's just a much more jagged profile, and some of that may be the scale of the access, but I think a lot of it is more than that. And I'm just curious if that's something that DMM is, also kind of looking into, as just sort of the drivers for the volatility in that requirement, and if there are potential need for other enhancements that may, remove some of that, or if it's really valid to be having that much volatility in the requirement. Valid or useful, I guess I should say.
So for these exact days, I haven't looked at what's causing the jaggedness, but I have looked at other days, and it really gets to the construct of the capacity test requirement. If you think about it as taking the total load and minus generation-based schedules and net import-based schedules, a lot of the jaggedness comes from 1 hour to the next. Changes in those base schedules where kind of between intervals a lot of times it's the change in load. But yeah, we could look at those more and see if we can get a kind of a more specific explanation for those.
Sure. It may tie in somewhat to some of Michelle's questions as well, with maybe some volatility that's moving around in transfers that might be driving some of that as well. But to be able to target passing a test and sort of setting things up, having some stability might be more useful. But definitely appreciate all the information you all have put together on this, and it's very useful. Thanks.
Sure. Any other questions?
Just one note from me on the requirement itself. Kyle has two lines on this chart showing the requirement. The first is a solid black line, and the dash below it is the requirement without uncertainty. Since this period in the summer, the ISO actually lifted the uncertainty adder from the bid range capacity test.
Okay. So let's move to the impact across the Western energy imbalance market. So here is looking at first the impact last summer. The metric estimates additional upward capacity test failures because of the proposed changes, again, related to the treatment of offline resources. Here, areas that weren't impacted or wouldn't have had any additional capacity test failures aren't included in the chart. So looking at the results last summer, the enhancement here would have only impacted Arizona Public Service, KISO, Pacific East, and then mostly Salt River Project. Now, I've split out the additional capacity test failures based on whether the flexibility test also passed or failed. The outcome of failing either test is the same. So in this yellow region, when the flexibility tests failed, WEIM transfers would have been capped regardless of the capacity test result. So looking at just the green area for SRP, this would have been around 6 additional hours in which WEIM imports into the area would have been capped last summer. Now, I have one sample day for Salt River Project. This is August 16th. On this day, there was around 160 megawatts that would have been excluded based on a few resources which were offline at the time of the test and had a startup and minimum uptime that exceeded what could be committed in the short-term unit horizon. So this might be something of more of an extreme day for SRP, but you can see that for here, this was the difference between passing and failing the test in 15 intervals. And if I go to this last metric here, this one was not included in the recent report, but shows the estimated additional failures through January 2022. Looking at the results since October, you see a few additional failure intervals with LEDWP in November, but otherwise it's really a similar story as over the summer, with the largest impact with SRP. And I'll say here that this analysis assumes that really all else being equal. I can't say whether if these enhancements were in place, whether SRP or any of the other areas would have had any changes in behavior. But I can say with SRP that we did see the most capacity test failures last summer from them. So if you're closer to the edge of passing or failing, it's makes sense that it's more likely that a change like this would have an impact. And with that, that's all I planned for today. Are there any questions on this section or any of the other sections in the report?
Kyle, I'm not seeing any questions on the phone. Thank you all for your attention and your questions today. If you do have additional suggestions, such as looking at the difference in tagging, transmission tag timing for imports, for example, please do send those to the Department of Market Monitoring. And I believe, Kyle, your next slide gives the address for that. We're happy to take those suggestions.
All right, thank you for your time today. I think we can close the call.
Thanks, everyone.